Start the meeting.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. This is the 9 a.m. Adult Bible Study for Boulder City United Methodist Church. Speaking for the record. So welcome, everyone. Glad you're here. We will start in with an opening prayer in a moment, but I just wanted to recognize that we have a good group today. Thank you very much for joining. I have 14 people listed. And that is an accurate count.
I don't know about David Paulson. I just think that we don't know what he really looks like anymore.
He actually came on with this picture a minute ago. There he is.
Well, he even has a fake picture sometimes.
Okay, everyone. We're going to start with our opening prayer. Before we do that, we're going to talk about our goals for today on session 2. By the way, let me go back to the title. Session 2, part 2 is crime, racism, terrorism, and politics. Stuff we don't talk about at all anymore. So we're going to get a chance to actually talk about it today because we've never talked about this anytime in the last few months. Our goals today are to explore contemporary events and trends in gender fear in contemporary people, including questions of politics, race, terrorism, and politics. Again, crime was the first one. And we're going to examine the biblical roots of courageous compassion and envision actions to incorporate this quality in our lives and community of faith. So you're welcome to join me in the opening prayer. Creator God, who set the stars in the heavens, give us the ears to hear the drumbeat of your steadfast love, upholding the universe. Renew our senses so that we can be attuned to your ways. Courage in these days, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Sorry, while I get the player changed. I probably got to get a second player so I can just go back and forth.
Put that to work.
So we are going to start with the video and discussion. I will put everybody on mute, and I'll try not to mute Sheila because last week we muted her and she couldn't join us to talk because I had muted her and she couldn't unmute herself for some reason.
No.
She's unmutable.
Something like that.
It's great to join you again today. I am so excited about the conversation we have a chance to have about fear, because fear is such a prevalent part of our lives, and it affects so much in our society. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is our fear as it relates to crime, as it relates to race, terrorism, and politics, some really big issues. And we're going to unpack that a bit. As I've studied fear, one of the things that becomes clear is we fear the things we don't know. We fear the people that we don't know. And there are folks always ready to make us afraid. I think about the news channels, right? 24-hour news. Well, nobody wants to turn on 24-hour news to watch a fireman rescue a cat. So what we've got to do is we've got to find the most salacious or the most violent or the most, fearful thing that's happened. And though it may be a 1 in 6 million chance it's going to happen, we're watching it, all of us together on the news, and that helps create that fear. And I think about, I don't know which journalist said, if it bleeds, it leads.
Mm.
And if it bleeds, it reads. And so people are, we're drawn to read or to watch the things that are either frightening or unsettling. And then we begin to find in our hearts and our minds, really, that we become fearful of things that we really don't need to be fearful of. And when I think about this, we have this tendency to, catastrophize things, to think that things are, far worse than they are. And I think about that, say, when it comes to crime. So there's a whole lot of people who are afraid that, the world is more violent today. It's more crime-ridden. And I spent time researching, the facts. And what I found is that violent crime is actually down to its lowest level since 1964, the year I was born.
Wow.
But our assumption is that, violent crime is rampant. It's worse than it's ever been. And that leads us to think I need to have a way of protecting myself. I need to be afraid and suspicious of the other person. And it struck me, there was, as I was researching this book, that year there were 15,000 murders. That same year, 250,000 people, it was estimated, died in hospitals from mistakes that were made in the hospital. So you think about that. Which are people more terrified by? They're terrified that they might get killed if I need to do something because I might be, violently hurt, or are they terrified that if I go to the hospital, I might die from, a medical mistake? And nobody's afraid of that second scenario, but we're very afraid of, violent crime, which has actually gone down dramatically over the years. Or I think of heart disease. For every person who dies of murder in the year, 40 people die of heart disease, and yet we're not so terrified that we're exercising and, and doing all the things we need to do to address that. And so getting the facts seems really important. And what I find interesting is, say as we think about the election season, we get 60-second commercials that are aimed at telling us why we shouldn't vote for the other person. It's not the, powerful, positive vision I have for what I'm going to do as a politician, but so often what we hear is the scary voice, the announcer and the scary voice telling us how bad things are going to be if somebody else is elected to office. And so I guess I'd like to have our conversation here revolve around this idea of fear of the other, fear of, how fear motivates us when it comes to politics or society, crime, even terrorism. Of course, the terrorist uses a megaphone by committing an act, that's broadcast over and over again on the television. So I'm wondering, how does fear affect us as a society? Where do you see that? What are your experiences of it?
Looking at the power of the media and the power of all this information that is available, it creates this fear in the community. And like, if we're speaking in my context, a lot of my community do not have a high degree of education or anything. Everything their main source of information is Facebook or is Twitter. And so that creates a little bit of an extra tension. It's just you not only have fear, but also you start to create a little bit of that resistance and maybe a way overprotective in having conversations that actually maybe be a healing experience.
News and the social media movement, I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know what's a fact and what's sensationalized or what's somebody's opinion on Twitter. It's their take on the news story, but I don't go read the official news story. I just read everybody's take on the news story. So then I realize, oh, wait a minute, what's the truth here? And I will feel my blood pressure rising. I mean, truly, there isn't any social media that I feel better after reading. There's no channel or outlet that helps me, that I actually come away from it going, wow, I'm really glad I checked that feed. And so I noticed it boiling the fear. And the only way for me to avoid that is try to stay out of it. And yet it's a news source.
Right.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. We live today in a time where people talk about fake news a lot. And the reality might be that there's actually, if it's not fake news, it's sensationalized news or exaggerated news or one-sided news on both the left and the right.
Right.
And if all you get is your information from one source or from one group of sources that lean in the same direction, it's hard to know, am I getting, the fair and unbiased? And everybody claims they're fair and unbiased. Fox News claims they're fair and unbiased, and so does NPR, and so does MSNBC, and yet somehow they're reporting the news somewhat differently. And so where have you seen, Marie, where have you seen this issue of fear creating, addressing our society or changing our society, or, how do you experience that?
I think we bring into the situation with social media our social location in life. We bring in components of the quadrilateral. We bring in our life experience. We bring in our traditions and how we interpret what we read through Twitter and what we read through Facebook. And that sometimes will be false events or interpreting in a way that it wasn't meant to be, or presented it on Facebook in a way that it's not meant to be. Yes, and so then that fear is put into the community of what your social location interprets it as, whereas mine interprets it a different way.
Yeah, I found one of my friends in Kansas City, Emmanuel Cleaver, is an African-American pastor. And we grew up, he's a little younger than I am, but grew up in the same, city. I grew up as a child I don't think there was a person of color in my elementary school. And so my understanding, I was taught that there was a certain street in Kansas City you weren't to go on the other side of, because you could get hurt. Somebody might actually hurt you over there. I don't know that my parents taught me that. I just know it was ingrained in me from the time I was a kid. He and I sat down at lunch and he said, I was taught the same thing about going to your side of the street. And I thought, how interesting that somewhere, even when we're little, we begin to be taught to fear the other person. And so I wondered, how do we overcome those fears? How do our people come not to fear each other, but instead come to embrace one another? What does that look like?
Well, in my context, one of the things that I've learned is that there is this self-preservation effort that we have to, we feel that we have to protect our culture. It defines who we are in our past, and also involves what's going to be our future in our community. So I think that there is this a great opportunity for us to have conversations, to understand that we can, that we are not going to lose our culture, we're not going to lose our tradition, but just for us to be open to understand others, so that we may be able to have a good neighborly experience in our communities.
Yeah, it seems like overcoming fear of the other is in large part about getting to know the other and hearing their stories. We don't have to give up who we are in order to know and appreciate the other, but when I see another person's humanity, I see their love for their children, I see their same fears and common desires and hopes and dreams. I remember we're both human beings. I don't have to be afraid of you because you're different. I actually value you and value those differences.
Yeah, for me, it's knowledge. And in seminary, I loved the world religion courses. And we had a semester on Islam. That was so powerful. And I would say it confirmed my beliefs in Christianity after learning about Muslim, because we share so many of the same. I saw it interpreted in their eyes differently. So there's a chapter dedicated to Mary in the Quran. There are Jesus healing stories in the Quran. We all are following the same story of Abraham. And so if we share so many of the same beliefs, if we would just come together and have the conversation, it's beautiful.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation around how we overcome our fears by finding knowledge, building relationships with people, and I think that's critical for me not being afraid, but instead learning how to practice love. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation today. Well, my guest in this session is Bishop, Professor, Pastor, Mentor, Theologian, Will Willimon. He is a man who needs almost no introduction in the United Methodist Church. He's one of the most influential teachers, preachers, mentors, leaders in the United Methodist Church today. And I also consider him a mentor and a friend. And I really appreciate you being with us today, Bishop Willimon. Thank you so much.
It's wonderful to be part of this, Adam.
Thank you. I really appreciated, in 2016, you wrote a little book called Fear of the Other. And in that book, you were addressing a lot of the fears that you were seeing in our country at that time. My small group read the book, really appreciated and enjoyed it. And I wanted to ask you, as we're talking about living unafraid with courage and hope, what prompted you to write Fear of the Other?
I think it was the then current presidential nomination process, in which, as many noted, fear played a big role in that. And the candidates on both sides played to many of our fears about immigration, about national security, employment, the economy. In fact, in 2016, xenophobia was declared the word of the year by dictionary.com. And so I guess the specter of watching our political leaders sort of leverage up our fears into votes for them made me think, well, gosh, we need to do some Christian thinking about fear.
Absolutely. So for those who don't remember what xenophobia means, why don't you remind us?
Well, it comes from the Greek word xenos, which appears a lot of times in the New Testament. Xenoi or others. Xenos is the other. And xenophobia is a big word for fear of the other.
So when you think of the people that folks are afraid of, when we think of fear of the other, the xenos, what are those groups of folks today that we find the greatest fear of? You mentioned a number of them in your book.
Oh, well, I lived through the immigration laws and battle in Alabama. Certainly, a lot of the talk about immigration suggests that this fear, and a lot of things that are said about immigration, like this is taking away American jobs, or we can't sufficiently integrate this many newcomers into our country, or that immigrants are the source of crime. Many of those fears are irrational and suggest, and of course our xenophobia, when applied to immigration, has a long and sort of sad record in America. From time to time it bubbles back up. So that's one fear I thought of. Also thought of fears of people of other races, of other cultures, living in this culture, fears of crime, economic fears.
So if that fear is hardwired in us, that we're a little cautious about the other, they could be a threat to us because they're different from us, how do we overcome that? And what role does our faith play in leading us to do the hard work of overcoming it?
Well, to me, that is the question for us as Christians, because we believe Jesus Christ is able, that he is able to overcome a host of perfectly normal, natural human dispositions, one of them being fear of the other. And this is one thing you can see in the New Testament, and that is, you can imagine the resentment Jews had against Gentiles, who had often persecuted them and put them in bondage, etc. Well, it's just amazing in these early Christian congregations, and you can feel this in 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans and all. Paul is dealing with the fact that he says, welcome one another. Welcome these others, these ones that you down through the ages have feared and despised and resented, these others who their people often hurt you. Welcome them as you, the God's enemy, God's feared one, as you have been welcomed in Christ. And it's rather remarkable. And in fact, I go on to say that I think today you look at the Christian congregation and it becomes a kind of witness to the world. Jesus Christ actually makes possible for people to be gathered in intimate, loving relationships and community of people who have very little in common, people from different backgrounds and different races. And the church is sort of God's showcase of what the grace of Christ can do in lives.
That's fantastic. Bishop, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I so appreciate you, your heart, who you are, and your words have been a source of encouragement to me, and I know to many others. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Adam, for helping all of us live lives unafraid in Christ.
Thank you. The bishop's words made it clear that deep down inside, we are hardwired to be cautious, even afraid of those who are different from ourselves. And we have to overcome that. We have to decide that this is a value, that we're going to overcome that. We have to work at it. We have to build relationships, get to know people, hear their stories. We come to see that they're not so different than we are. And so my hope and prayer is that we might be people who, in relationship with other people, as we look at the issues in our society, as we think about people who are different politically, sociologically, and certainly racially from ourselves, that we might be people who live unafraid, with courage and hope.
Okay, that was really interesting. If you want to speak, remember to unmute yourself. First question. By the way, I don't think I said there was a quiz afterwards, but there usually is a quiz, so we're having a quiz. How did Carlos see the impulse to protect his culture as a help and a hindrance in overcoming fear of others? Don't all speak at once. All right, while you're thinking about that question, someone's on the call and that's got the handle LG Aristo 2 Plus. Could whoever that is unmute themselves and let us know who they are? So I've unmuted you. Could you let us know who you are so I have you in the list? Aristo, LG Aristo? Okay. I can't tell who it is. Anyway. So anybody have an idea what Carlos said? Okay. My notes said he was talking about protecting his culture, but he felt the only way to be open to understand others was to engage them in conversation and get to learn more about the individual and what that individual within a group, as opposed to just assuming that it's the whole group. Okay, the next question: what role did gaining knowledge play for Ginger in overcoming misunderstandings about followers of Islam?
I think knowledge of anything helps a better understanding, and relating to what she said to the discussion at the very beginning about the media. Many of us have fallen into the trap, I do it myself, of having the media be the source of how we look at issues rather than taking the time to actually read for ourselves or do research. I mean, there is good material out there that can tell us the reality of whether immigrants are taking Americans' jobs or any number of issues. And we need to be more responsible to do the research ourselves than just rely on something we hear on the media, when it is very hard to discern what's fact and fiction.
Okay. Anyone else?
Another way I think that we make judgments according just to headlines rather than reading an entire story or a long article or watching a long video. We just make our assumptions from the headlines, and that might not be true. They may be wrong.
Okay, I had a note that the people were having trouble seeing the slides. Does everybody see the slide? It should say video and discussion.
Yes.
Okay, good. So there was a question about xenophobia. I think most of us know what xenophobia is. We've hearing it all the time. And then, but what was the specific comment that he was making about xenophobia? Bishop William Williman. Anybody pick up on that?
It seemed like one thing two things he was saying. One, that if you once interact with somebody else and get to know them, that takes away the fear. And also through the Christian church, because and Christianity, because it brings different people together. It makes us one body than separate. But what I was thinking of is I was hearing him talk about coming together and coming together through our church communities. We have a lot of systemic things in our society that separate us. There are laws that limit where people can buy a home, and therefore it makes communities that are extremely one culture over another. And so, I mean, yes, we should come together, but if, because you are different than me, you have to live in a community 5 or 6 miles away from me, it's very unlikely that we're going to go to the same church. And so systemically, we have built separation into our society, which makes it very hard in education, in worship, in a whole variety of ways of life to really come together and get to know people. And I mean, really know them individually as people.
Yeah, good point. Well, there are laws against those things, but there still is steering going on. There's still, you know, if you're a person of color, you may not get shown the home in the gated community. So, and a lot of it depends on your social status. So there's still a lot of that going on. You're right, Barbara.
Not all the laws have gone away. Not all the laws, yeah. Or they were around long enough that they set the scene that made it very difficult now to change.
And you heard Adam talk about Troost Avenue and which side of Troost Avenue were you on, and we're going to talk a little bit more of that in a minute here. I want to move along, but what I thought it was very important to hear what the bishop said about groups to fear. So I know growing up, we were always told to fear the Soviet Union, the red menace. Now it's Russia, North Korea, and Iran, right?
Right.
The axis of evil. Remember the axis of evil from a few years ago? Now we're still having some of that come back. Different races and cultures, crime, lots of things. We have plenty of things to fear, and the newspaper headlines don't help us. By the way, does everybody know what the purpose of a headline is? Why do we have headlines?
To grab our attention.
To see if we want to read the rest of the article.
Right, but and
sell papers.
These sell papers. There you go. And actually, what are papers actually selling? Advertising, right? So right. if their circulation is up, they'll get more money for their advertising. They can charge more for their ads. Same with TV news. The TV that's commercial TV that has advertising
disappeared.
So the headline is what, when people used to buy their newspapers on the stands as opposed to getting them delivered every day, the headline is what people read, right? The big headline. So I buy the newspaper because of the headline, and the articles may have nothing to do with the headline. TV news, they do the teasers. They try to get you to make sure, big event, you need to know all about it. Come back at 11 o'clock, so watch it. If it's so important, or come back the next day. If it's so important, why don't they tell us right then? But they don't. They want you to come back and continue watching or watch the next show, and then they lead you in. Coming up in a few minutes, we're going to talk about whatever the topic is. And when do they put that on? At the very end of the show. So you have to listen to the whole show and watch all the ads before you can actually get there. So how about news sources? We have way too many news sources now when you add all the social media and everything, but are you looking at different news sources for your information? Are you just reading, I mean, if you're only watching NBC News, if you're only watching Fox News and not watching each of them at times, you're only going to get one side of the story. As much as everyone purports to be unbiased. So I did a little check on some newspaper headlines. Just in today's paper, the front page of the RJ, new fear grows. A little bit later on the front page, down a little bit lower, was resort workers not in the know on virus. Then on the inside page, virus deaths take expected bad turn. Of course, everything's about the virus almost nowadays. And then there was another one a little bit later, virus cases rise, cases, it should be cases, not cased, sorry. Cases rise in South Africa and India. Nowhere in those headlines did they talk about the cases that are down in a lot of places. There's places in Europe, I heard on the news this morning, there's places in Europe where the deaths have gone way down. The cases have gone way down. Vietnam has had no cases, no deaths. So at least no reported deaths. Again, you got to go by, to some extent, you have to take what you read and question it. But then think about the TV news. What's been in the news this past year or two or three? Collusion, obstruction, fair and unbiased, hoax, bias, witch hunt, fake news. So there's just been so much of that thrown around. It's very hard to find out what the true story is. And when the true story comes out, it comes out on page 5 in the small print, right? Whereas the story they want you to hear came out in page 1. So think about your news sources. I was thinking about the quote that you hear about don't believe anything you read or see or hear or whatever. I actually found 3 quotes that were very close. They're up on the screen. Don't believe everything you hear, don't believe everything you read, and only believe half of what you see. Believe what you like, but don't believe everything you read without questioning it. Good advice.
Why it's important to do some research beyond the news, because even if you read a whole story, it's just giving you a snippet of what that issue is. It's not giving you the background, the history, where it came from. We just don't do enough research on our own. We rely too much on what other people are telling us, particularly if what they're telling us fits in with what we have already decided that we believe. You're right when you say we need to listen to a variety of sources, because no one source is going to give you the complete picture.
And if you're somewhat suspicious, you can always just Google fact checked and then whatever the headline is or the major feature, and then either Snow or one of the other fact checks will come up. And sometimes to get a different perspective on things, if you've got Dish, go to 2119 and you get CNGTV, which is the China news today. And well, it is a different perspective.
That's true.
Surprising to me on their talk shows how much more straightforward and honest that they are about their political situation than we find that we hear about our own. So.
On my TV, I get the French news channel, which is for English American broadcast. And they also are very unbiased. And it's very interesting to watch them and just see things factually presented instead of sides and emotions and biases.
Yeah, on our most recent internet change, I lost French on French 24, and then the German and the Japanese and Korean news. Barbara was getting on my case. I don't do anything but watch the news. So, but now we're narrowed down.
So here's this. Can you see the screen that's got up now? It should be a list of all the different quotes about "Don't believe everything you read." Is that up on everybody's screen? Okay, good.
Yes.
I was struggling to find it. This was just Googling that quote, and this is what came up. One of the very most interesting things I saw was don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. Abraham Lincoln. So I guess he was very, very prophetic to come up with that quote about the internet.
Now, on one news report, I think it was on public radio a while back, and it was on a controversial topic. It was on climate change, and finally the person that was being interviewed said, well, he said, the one thing you have to remember, everyone can have their own opinion. Everyone can't have their own set of facts.
But they do.
But well, we all take our opinions and determine that it is now fact. And opinion and facts are not the same thing.
Well, what was the press secretary that said that these are alternate facts? And I mean, that was on public television for all of us to hear. And it kind of blew the credibility of that person as far as I was concerned.
I've heard lots of people speak with things that I think they're very questionable credibility, and I won't even talk about who they are or what they said. I think, unfortunately, our biases always come up and affect what we think about things. I did write down a couple notes about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament regarding fear. During when the bishop was talking, in the Old Testament, it was fear of God, the wrath of God. God was going to strike you down. And then when Jesus came along, it was overcoming that fear, and we found we have a loving God now. I think it's the same God. I just think it's a perspective.
Yeah, it's the same God. Well, it's the same God, but in the Old Testament, when you talk about the fear of God, it's talking about the awe of God mostly. There are no doubt parts in there that talk about the wrath of God. It's usually in the context where you have to figure out, what's talking about. But it definitely is the same God of both testaments.
Yes. I understand that. I think the other point was Paul's comment about welcoming others.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's part of a church's outreach program, is how do you get out and reach out to others and not just keep it as a closed community, but get out. And as Adam points out, and many others have, sometimes our religions and our religious leaders instill fear. I can still remember in high school our Dr. Foster, who would always preach sermons, particularly to the 9:30 service, which was for the children's service. It was aimed at the high school kids who were in the choir, and he'd turn around and look at the choir when he was doing his preaching about all the things we were doing and we weren't supposed to be doing. And he spent a lot of time talking about that. So any other thoughts on this? I want to move on to the next item on our list.
Just one quick thing. This may not be that important, but it's just something I thought of at the beginning of the video when he was talking about, you know, the things that we fear, like getting shot or a car accident or whatever, and how we don't fear these other things like possibly dying as a result of being in the hospital or of a heart attack or whatever. Well, the things that we fear are the ones that we feel most that we don't have any control over, or that we have limited control, or that the only way we have control is by staying in the environment that we feel very safe, don't venturing out into these other scary places and that. Whereas some of these other things, say like having a heart attack or dying from smoking or whatever, those are very delayed. I mean, you can sit down and have 2 pounds of bacon to eat today and you're not going to have a heart attack tomorrow. Many of the things that are most dangerous for us, but we don't really fear, it's because it's things that we do day after day after day after day for 20 or 30 years before it has a negative effect. So there's no power of fear there, where there is a power of fear. If I step across this street, I might get shot or something like that. So
yeah, and I'm not going to debate you on that, but I will give you an alternate perspective, and that's having worked in the nuclear industry my whole career. The fear of radiation will strike that instant fear in people because they somehow equate that to atomic weapons or nuclear weapons, and think that they're going to die, you know, in a few minutes because that power plant's there, as opposed to their health actually getting better in the community because of all the healthy workers that are being brought in and all the jobs that are being created. The fear of radiation is one of those unknowns and things you can't touch that invokes that level of fear as if it was an instantaneous issue. But again, I'm not going to debate that with you. I just want to mention that perspective. Thoughts on crime. So you heard Adam talk a little bit about crime. I think if you read the papers, you'll think crime is up and it's rampant. We're getting a lot more publicity on crime because of between body cameras and video cameras and camera phones and all this. We're now seeing instantly pieces of information out there for everyone. So does anybody really know what the statistics are? Oh, I know. I just got to go to the other screen. Okay.
Just in today's paper, RJ mentioned that domestic violence is down. They didn't expect that in the coronavirus.
Yeah, there was an article today that showed different crime statistics. Crime is actually up in a couple places compared to what it was a little bit earlier during the pandemic. I want to get to a different screen here and get to this. So I did look at some statistics, facts about crime in the U.S. Violent crime has fallen sharply over the past quarter century, and there's some Bureau of Justice statistics you can go to actually find out what the statistics are for your areas in different categories. Here's some graphs. I believe one of the graphs was very similar to this, was in Adam's book, showing the crime going down. Property crime has declined significantly. However, public perception of crime is at odds with the data, and that was something he pointed out in the book. And there's also large geographic variations in the crime rates. Another interesting comment was that most crimes are not reported to police, and most reported crimes are not solved. Very interesting statistic. Obviously, there's plenty of crimes that are solved, and there's plenty of crimes that may take many years to be solved. And we see those in the paper almost every day. There's a crime somebody committed years ago that the cold case squad gets on and actually goes and finds them. There's some new information comes out, DNA testing, exonerates somebody who's been in prison for 20 years because they were accused of a crime that they didn't commit. So there's a lot of that going on as well.
We have a different kind of crime that's going on much more prevalently that we've had to face as a nation. And that is the way that we look at our institutions that we've always, not always and not all we, but some of us that have considered as basic strengths to keep our democracy going. And now we fear our own government, some of us do, more than we ever have before. And that includes our own Justice Department, our own FBI, our own Secret Service. And as growing up, that was never something since the 50s that we looked at as being fearful of. So I think that is a whole level of fear that is undermining our day-to-day living. And to me, it's the most terrifying of all to see our democratic institutions breaking down.
Yeah, and I think there's a debate on how much of that is real and how much of that is based on what we're getting from news reports and real information. I think personally, I think that a lot of the information is overblown. I think and that's my personal opinion. I think that we're highlighting, just like the police, we're highlighting a few bad actors as opposed to recognizing what the 95 or 98 percentile is. So Myra, I'm not saying that the fear is not real. I think the fear is definitely real. What I'm saying is, I think that there are facts out there that may
I've never heard someone in the highest law office in the land go ahead and support white supremacy, not deny the Ku Klux Klan and these kind of things. That's a very different thing for me, especially being born in the South and being terrified of the KKK and all of this kind of stuff. So there are some of us, whether it's blown up in the news reports but to ever hear those words come out of a president's mouth is terrifying.
Yeah, okay, well, again, I'm not gonna.
We're not gonna debate it, but I'm saying not all of that is media. That's
true, not all of it's media.
Maybe 20 years ago, it would not have been reported, but now it is reported.
And I think we've got a very interesting situation going on right now in the country about how things are being dealt with, and how the politicians are dealing with them versus the people who aren't politicians but are in high offices.
Yes, that's very unusual.
And instead of hearing the whitewashed comments, and I'll use that term appropriately, and withheld comments, we're hearing it all, and part of it's because of Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, or whatever these other things are, that there's no time to think between the time the words come out and the time that they get out. So it's just best I can say is we're living in interesting times.
I think we're living in fearful times.
Well, I think that's right, and that's why we're having this study to just talk about it.
That's right.
So let's move on. We have 10 minutes to cover an hour and a half's worth of material.
That's not going to work, is it?
So there's a section in the book, chapter 6, on get to know your neighbors. And I just want to ask very quickly, do we have a Troost Avenue in Boulder City? Does anybody know of an area in Boulder City we should be concerned about as far as our neighbors, or places we need to go to get to know our neighbors better?
Place where I live now, you need to fear me.
You haven't moved yet, have you?
Yes.
Yes, I have.
Oh, you've moved. Okay.
I've
I'm not sure about that, but I think the area you were living in, I would be more concerned about than the area you are in now.
I would agree with that, yes.
But how about Henderson? Is there a place in Henderson you might be concerned about? Or
Yeah, where Jeff and Tom are. You don't want to go near them.
Yeah, I think the Galleria Mall I get really concerned about. But there are places in Las Vegas that I wouldn't want to be, and probably just because I don't know the neighborhood or don't know the people. Certainly in Los Angeles and New York City, I've been to both of those cities, not recently, but where I had there was plenty of places to be concerned about if you were driving alone or walking alone.
Yeah, I think in Washington, D.C., there's plenty of places like that that you're afraid to go into. Yeah.
Lived in Washington, D.C., as you know, Sheila, a lot of our time. So there's definitely places that that the neighborhoods were concerned.
Yeah.
And then we've got the whole
very
terrace.
scary.
We've got the whole.
And it would be,
Go ahead.
it would be interesting. I mean, I can think of places in Las Vegas that I may say that I would feel uncomfortable or concerned going to, but I would be interested to talk to people that go to a church in that community. And I would venture to guess that they would have a totally different view of that community, not see it nearly as fearful, and maybe fearful of places that I never even thought about being concerned about.
Hey, Scott.
Exactly. And the comments that Adam made about Troost Avenue and the black church versus, and get to know the pastor of the black church and how he was brought up to think about the problems on the other side of the street. Yes, Rick.
On your participants, you have a raised hand.
Okay.
Maybe that person can't unmute themselves.
Let me see about, this was the person I tried to get to talk earlier.
Right, maybe they can't unmute themselves.
All right. Aristo 2 Plus, did you want to say something?
Can you unmute them, Scott?
I did. They're unmuted.
Scott, I don't know if it's me that you're talking about.
Who is it?
I don't know if you see it's Kimberly.
Yes, that must be you, Kim.
Okay, sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. You normally come up with your name on it, so this is the first time we've seen that.
I know technical difficulties, and I'm kind of over it. So I'm
right.
sorry I wasn't responsive to click into that with you. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you. No, we know you're here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I know originally I couldn't unmute myself, so I went out and bought a microphone because there wasn't any way I could talk. So now it's at your disadvantage, I guess.
Okay, Rick, are you going to make up for the last several weeks when you couldn't talk?
I don't have any idea. It's just really good to be here.
So I'm glad we just heard Rick volunteer to run the next session or two since he wants to have a chance to talk. So the last chapter deals with the politics, and it had an interesting title, Exploring the Possibilities of a Hospitable Spectrum. So Myra, I think that works right into your discussion. And there, like I said, there was so much material. I didn't try to. There's no way to cover all this in an hour. Hopefully, people had a chance to think about it and read the material. If they haven't, suggest you continue to do so. Next week, we'll start with section 3, and I just had that page marked a minute ago. Oh, there was something there was a they wanted us to play a role playing thing about Chicken Little or a Henny Penny, and it would have been very fun. But I think it would have taken up the whole time. So I chose not to do that. But you know, I like this comment at the very end on page 81. No, Henny Penny, the sky is not falling. God is our refuge and strength, a help always near in terms of great troubles. That's why we don't have to be afraid, even though the world seems to be falling apart. So I want to move to our closing prayer. And then after the closing prayer is the hymn that the closing prayer comes from. So I just pulled out a couple words out of the closing prayer. It's actually talked about in chapter 7. It's hymn number 577, which is God of grace and God of glory. So we're going to pick out a line from that to use as our closing prayer. Dear God, grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the living of these days. Amen. And now, I will start this video and share the screen, and that will be the end. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Scott, this was very good today. I really enjoyed it.
Good.
Thank you, Scott.
Everybody should see the hymn coming up on the screen. All together. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good afternoon.
Scott, check the chat room before you leave.
Oh, I think it's great.
Okay, I just thought sometime we might have a discussion about them because
Yeah, I've not spent a lot of time